Hi, I'll continue with paragraph 25 of the chapter on Appoggiaturas in Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's Versuch, über wahre Art das Clavier zu spielen. Aus diesem letzten Versehen sind die hässlichen Nachschläge entstanden, die sogar außerordentlich Mode sind und welche, leider noch dazu, nicht eher gebraucht werden als bei den sangbarsten Gedanken. Zum Exempel B. Wenn ja Vorschläge hierbei angebracht werden sollten und müssten, so ist die Ausführung bei den mit Stern markierten Beispielen leidlicher. Man sieht hieraus, dass man diese Fehler verbessern kann, wenn aus diesen Nachschlägen Vorschläge werden. Bei Figur 21 ist ein Fall, wo die Nachschläge gut und gewöhnlich sind. Das letzte Exempel ist mehr Mode als nach der Harmonie reine. So there are two examples for figure 20b, and at the beginning of each we see notated what Bach would consider belongs to the most singable ideas or thoughts. And then following those, Bach writes out how Lilliput would perform them, were they to add Appoggiaturas, and then how they'd be better performed. And those are those bars marked with an asterisk. And Bach says, unfortunately, it's the most singable ideas that Lilliput does this to. He begins the paragraph saying the last oversight. And the oversight to which Bach is referring, he mentioned at the end of the last paragraph, and which I looked at in the last video. And that was when the appoggiatura is included in the subdivision of the previous note. And what Bach says in paragraph 23 and 24 of the chapter on ornaments in general, which I covered in part 5 of the videos on ornaments, titled A Lesson for Kissing, and that was about ornaments indicated by small notes belonging to the following note. Well, that can be connected to this. And so I was talking about, ornaments indicated by small notes, and about how I've seen in a masterclass how it was recommended that they be played before the beat. And so when somebody, in the role of honor in a masterclass or a professor in the lesson advises a student to play those notes before the beat, they are encouraging the student to create what Bach refers to as ugly follow-on notes. They're called Nachschläge, and I translate them as follow-on notes for the want of a better term. And there's no word in English that I've found that I feel adequately describes them. Describes them as well as Nachschlag describes them. And I might have mentioned this already, but also I'm not happy with the term Appoggiatura, because Appoggiatura doesn't allude to the Abzug, or the principal note, whereas with Vorschlag, the focus on the Abzug is in the word. And, Schlag translates as hit or strike. And that would be the principal note, the strike. And vor means before or pre. So like the German word Vormittag would mean morning or forenoon or before midday. And then Nachschlag goes with Vorschlag, where nach means after or post, like in Nachmittag, that German word that means afternoon. So Nachschlag would be after the strike or post-strike, and Vorschlag would be pre-strike. And so generally I prefer the term Vorschlag over Appoggiatura. It better covers it's more descriptive and inclusive of everything that's involved. Yeah, so they encourage the student, or they themselves create a Nachschlag out of those small notes, just like Lilliput did then a days. And now they don't need to be in any doubt as to what Bach's opinion would be of their playing of those moments or of the advice they're giving to those students. In Mozart's Fantasy K475 in bar 29 is one of those singable ideas adorned with Appoggiaturas. So a version of what Bach is showing in his example. And from Bach's example we can imagine how Mozart's idea is to be performed and how Lilliput might have performed it. And maybe that first Appoggiatura, the B connected to the D, maybe that is there to safeguard against slipping into the Lilliput version. I could imagine perhaps if that D hadn't got an Appoggiatura and it only begun with the C sharp, that D would become dotted and the A Appoggiatura would be in the same sort of would be subdivided with that D instead of belonging to the C sharp. So here's the first example. The idea unadorned, and then how Lilliput plays it, thinking they are adding Appoggiaturas, and how a more tolerable version would sound. And here's the second example of 20B. Aside from the Lilliput way of playing it, Bach provides two ways of playing it in a better way. And the first one is where the first note of the second slur, B, gets a short, unchangeable Appoggiatura from above. And then in the next version, where the second note of each slur gets an Appoggiatura from above, a short Appoggiatura from above, and that's a third above, the opposite of what Mozart did. And so Bach is not only showing us how to perform the Appoggiaturas, he's also showing us two ways the idea can be adorned. And one can think of how in paragraph 23, the Vorschlag from above, written out in the bar, can get its own Appoggiatura when it repeats the previous note. Again, I don't want to tell you the difference, but you could perhaps wonder what differences there are between Bach and Lilliput. The next example is where the follow follow-on note, or the Nachschlag, is turned into an Appoggiatura. So one could imagine the D, indicated as a small note, being originally a Nachschlag, or a follow-on note of the C, and how Bach then corrected it by turning it into an Appoggiatura. And if you consider those demi-semiquavers, or 30-second notes at the start, as a written out and divided up in the bar ornament, you know, like the ones that the Roll of Honor advised in the masterclass to play before the beat. You could imagine Lilliput then playing them before the beat, on which the dotted C would land, and then the D would follow the C in the same beat. And I'll play that as Bach indicates it to be played, and then I'll play it with the D as a Nachschlag, so how Lilliput would play it, and then I'll try as well to play it with those two, with the 30-second notes played before the beat, to you know, just since I've mentioned it, and so you can hear the difference and wonder what the difference is. There's a bit of figuring out to do with these examples, and the next one is not so clear. And so how Bach has been doing it in previous examples, that bar added at the end would mean how it is better played. And so that would mean that the best way to correct this example is to leave the Nachschlag out, so that follow-on note on the second last beat of the bar, that E, that Bach is, you know, saying here that that's the way to correct it. And even though he didn't mention it in the text, it's often, not only do the examples illustrate what was said in the text, very often there's more there to learn from the examples that's in the text. And I was wondering if the E had been unintentionally omitted in the example, you know, so that the bar correcting the last two beats of the bar that Bach wrote in, that would rather look like the previous example, where the E would be written in as a small note before the G. But I'm pretty sure there is no mistake there. I mean, I have learned from looking through this book that any time I have thought Bach has made a mistake, I was wrong. And so I've learned never to, you know, assume or leave it at that, oh yeah, Bach made a mistake, and then move on. Because every single time I was tempted to do that, I found out I was wrong and Bach hadn't made a mistake, and it was something that I had overlooked or wasn't paying proper attention to. And so here I'm inclined to think that he added this in example to show a case where it's better to leave it out altogether, the Nachschlag. And I have reason to think that, but it will involve knowledge that you will be going over later on in the course of the chapters. But I'll just say that there is enough knowledge in this book. You're going to gain enough knowledge that you'll be able to know, like, what are their Bach's thought processes or not. You will be able to have your own thought processes where you will come to the conclusion, or to a strong conclusion, that there should be no Nachschlag there. And you can adapt to how you can look at the examples, and then you can understand, or you can start to anticipate or think why. Bach went through a process when he decided this example here did not need, or that it's best to leave the Nachschlag out altogether. Bach went through a certain process. He didn't just say, I prefer this. He thought about all the elements involved, and he came up with his answer. And so with the information, with the further knowledge you're going to acquire in the course of going through these chapters, you might be able to as well see how Bach would have come to the conclusion that no Nachschlag in this example is better than turning the Nachschlag into an Appoggiatura. And there's another thing with this example. If you notice the G Appoggiatura before the F sharp, that has the value of a quarter note or a crotchet, and so too does the F sharp. And if you think of what Bach said in paragraph 12, he said that this way of writing out the examples is not the most accurate. And then how he illustrated their execution. There was an example there where a quarter note had an appoggiatura of the value of a quarter note, and how Bach indicated how that was to be played was, instead of the appoggiatura taking half the value of the following note and being played as an 8th note, both appoggiatura and Abzug were both given the value of a quarter note. So that's kind of, as well, a bit puzzling why Bach would have left that there wrong. And I could imagine or wonder if this example here was taken from a composition of somebody else and Bach had written it in as it is. And it's generally the case that the composer who does damage to good taste will make other mistakes too. And so that might explain that what Bach would say incorrect notation of the Appoggiaturas. And I'll just say about coming up with the answer. When you're in the world of music, you move by the laws of nature. And if there's if you think of a stone on a hill, in the world of music, that stone will roll down the hill. And so it's Bach's knowledge of the world of music that will have him arrive at the answer that he presents. And in the, if you think of the stone rolling down the hill figuratively, in Bach's music, in Mozart's music, in Beethoven's music, whenever there is a stone and a hill in the music, that stone is going to roll down the hill. Whereas in the cage, where there's only notes and they have no consequence whatsoever, and it's all down to what do you prefer, Well, if you're getting a lesson in the cage and your professor's in the cage, and how he's teaching you is based on the recordings he's heard by those on the roll of honor who are in the cage, what might be the case there is that you have the stone on the hill, and instead of the stone rolling downwards, it's rolling up the hill, because it can roll up in a hill in the cage, because it's not actually, they're not in the world of music, so there is no consequence. You can play the notes as you like, because in reality there is no stone and there is no hill in the cage. Those are things that belong to the world of music, so they don't, they've no connection. What they have are notes instead of a stone on a hill, so they can have the what they wrongly perceive as a stone on a hill, they can have that stone going up the hill or sideways or flying through the air or doing anything, because it does not need to apply, it is not subject to the laws of nature, because it doesn't actually exist. So that will be a big element in figuring out why Bach arrived at the conclusion that Nachschlag would be best omitted rather than being turned into an appoggiatura in this case. And as well why that wasn't the case in the previous example. Bach decided that the Nachschlag, the D, could be turned into an appoggiatura and it wouldn't matter. So I won't play that appoggiatura and the F sharp as two quarter notes, because one, we don't know what follows. I don't know what follows. And two, I don't think it would be correct to do that. So I'll just play it as a normal long appoggiatura that takes half the value of the following note. And so, yeah, I'll play them there first as Lilliput plays it with the Nachschlag, with the follow-on note, and then the corrected version. And here's figure 21. So this is a case where the follow-on notes are good and usual. And first of all, Bach writes out the main idea, and then he provides 3 different Nachschläge or follow-on notes that are good. And I think Bach writes this in because he might have thought, hold on, if I write that bit at the start, people might think I'm generally against Nachschläge. And this could be a little composition lesson Bach is providing. Yeah, so he'd be saying Nachschläge or follow-on notes are something of their own, something in their own right. And they're not just appoggiaturas that mediocrity has usurped and tarnished. And just incidentally, you can see how large Lilliput has always been when Bach says that, that it is enormously or extraordinarily fashionable. Even though he was around and Mozart was around, and neither of them would have done that. It was still, Lilliput didn't really care what Bach and Mozart were doing. They took it and already went in the process of eradicating it. Yeah, so he shows the follow-on notes that are good and usual. And I think the clue of how to consider figure 21 could be in the last part of the sentence, where Bach says the last example is more trend than pure according to the harmony. And perhaps when I play it, you can hear how it could be trending. And then there's the numbers underneath that last example. And they're unexplained and they're a bit of a puzzle. They're not the figured bass, so they're not the harmony. And if they're not there by mistake, they could be fingering. Since if you've watched the videos on the chapter of fingering and how distance plays a role, that Bach is showing how you use the little finger on the G, despite the distance being not that great. So the third finger is free for the following E, and the other fingers around that for its ornament. And another motivator for the heads up from Bach might be what he'd said about the little finger only being used for the extremities. So that could explain those numbers, because they are not mentioned. They're not referred to in the text. But he did say something in his chapter on fingerings that he would deal with fingerings regarding the ornaments where necessary. So that could be this could be one of those moments. It's just weird that the fingerings are written perpendicular as opposed to horizontal. Yes, so I'll play each of those Nachschläge so you can hear them. And so there's a note Bach added in the appendix to this paragraph. And so I'll read that too. So the appendix to paragraph 25. Wenn einer beim Schlusse oder wenn die Melodie wenigstens nicht bald drauf heruntergeht, nach einem Vorschläge von unten, bevor die Hauptnote eintritt, nach einen ganz kurzen Vorschlag von oben macht, so ist solches zu vermeiden. And here are the examples that went with Appendix 25. So at the end, or when the melody doesn't soon descend, after an appoggiatura from below, one shouldn't play a short appoggiatura before the main note enters. And I think this can be connected to what Bach said in paragraph 15, to the example in tab 4, figure 11, with the asterisks, where when after a short note a disproportionately long note follows, that the appoggiatura before the latter doesn't work well. So Bach shows how it is, how it would appear, and then how Lilliput would perform it in the next bar with the short appoggiatura before the main note. And this is another clue as to how Lilliput was performing in those days, and I would as well dare to suggest how popular and exciting appoggiaturas were for them. And if you look at that, the way the B is slurred to the D, then in the way Lilliput would perform it with the short appoggiatura from above, that I would say that this is Bach indicating how Lilliput would perform it since the slur from the B to the D is completely wrong. Generally, so if Bach wanted that, he wouldn't have written it in. I mean, it's from what he said, this is completely wrong because the D is joined to the C, not to the B. So he's indicating that what Lilliput is doing is they're joining the D to the B. So he doesn't write out, rhythmically he doesn't write out what Lilliput are doing, but he indicates it by the slur. And maybe he didn't write it out rhythmically because he figured that would only lead to confusion as to how to perform the short appoggiatura from above. And he didn't want to leave it that you could think it's played before the beat and that the main note lands on the beat. So he added the slur to indicate how Lilliput performs it. And so that first example will be, like he said in the text, at the end. And the next one would be when the melody doesn't soon descend after the appoggiatura from below. And one could keep in mind here what was discussed in paragraph 24 about an appoggiatura being able to follow a trill when the trill has had an appoggiatura before it. And in connection to that, and what Bach said about tab 3 figure 4, G and E, that after a trill, an appoggiatura from below works better than one from above. If you remember, I was wondering if such a trill needs an appoggiatura before it. Because E, the example E, that had the trill where that example was what Bach referred to when he said an appoggiatura after a trill works better from below before the following note after the trill, as opposed to an appoggiatura from above after a trill. And so the example G had a trill with no appoggiatura before it, but the example E had an appoggiatura before the trill. So I was wondering if such a trill needs an appoggiatura before it. And well, this example could contribute towards an answer to that question, because what we see is the D with a trill without a preceding appoggiatura going to the E, which has an appoggiatura from below attached to it. So, and Bach would, this is not the mistake Bach wanted to illustrate in this example. He wanted to illustrate that the short appoggiatura before the note that follows the appoggiatura from below doesn't sound good. You know, and ultimately the answer is for oneself to find through one's own observation and trying it and wondering, what do I hear? What am I listening to? What's happening here? What do I hear? But it could be a clue to how Bach might answer it if you were to ask him, does a trill that is followed by an appoggiatura from below need its own appoggiatura? And so he might answer, you know, while providing the caveats, he might answer, no, not necessarily. So I'll play that first example, and I'll play it first of all as it is, and then with the completely short appoggiatura from above. And you can notice that even though it's written in as a 16th note, Bach says that appoggiatura is completely short. So more evidence to if there's ever a dispute or argument about, you know, should that appoggiatura have the value of a 16th note, or should it be shorter than a 16th note? Well, here's a point in defense. If you want to take the side, yes, it can be shorter, or it should be shorter than a 16th note. This is one piece of evidence you have that you can present to back up your side of the argument. And then I'll play it with the short appoggiatura, and I'll try and observe that slur that Bach included in there. And maybe you can hear again, I don't want to influence what you hear, but you know, when I think of that short appoggiatura and think like how you know, in the context of it being enormously fashionable, that I could imagine Bach is saying here, please stop, please don't do that. It's you know, but you know, you can make up your own mind. And this is the last example of that. Weil durch die kleinen Einzelnötigen oft etwas Mehreres als Vorschläge angedeutet werden, so wollen wir in der Folge das Nötige dieser Wegen anführen. So that's it. That's the chapter on Appoggiaturas. So if you think of what you've learned normally about Appoggiaturas, that, you know, if you think of 3 levels of education that one receives generally nowadays, there's the one level where they'll tell you, you know, the average educators will tell you that the appoggiatura takes half the value of the following note. Those who consider themselves a bit better, you know, higher quality, will tell you that appoggiatura means to lean. And then if they're really good, they'll tell you that when the note is dotted, the appoggiatura takes 2/3 of the value of the note. And then those are the ones that really know their stuff. And you can see, maybe you can see there, when you think that what we've had in these, this is part 9, the video, what we've had basically is a course on the appoggiatura, or on appoggiaturas. And you can see the discrepancy between what Lilliput knows and what Bach knows. And you can conclude from these videos and from this chapter that this as well was what Beethoven knew about the appoggiatura, and what Mozart knew about the appoggiatura, and what Haydn knew about the appoggiatura. And another thing you'll be taught, or you'll kind of go through the education system learning, is that understanding that Bach or Mozart and Beethoven, they were all given these incredible gifts. You know, you're given the understanding that, especially with Mozart, like no other, that he got this incredible gift from God. And that explains it all. And you can definitely read between the lines and guess that generally Mozart is considered a kind of a talented idiot, the luckiest, most talented idiot who ever lived. But you can see from this chapter that Mozart knew all this, and you can see that in his compositions, that you will not find, apart from K330, you will not find any mistakes in what Mozart did, or anything that contradicts or goes against what Bach has said here about the Appoggiaturas. And when you compare the amount of information you have gotten here in this course on Appoggiaturas with the amount of information you get in university or in lessons or in master classes or anywhere or on YouTube, you will see that Mozart outclassed the experts in terms of sheer knowledge and insight. And that and what Lilliput or this mediocrity projects onto, they're telling you what made Mozart. What made Mozart was this special gift he had, this extraordinary talent. But it's the knowledge and insight that made Mozart. And so what Lilliput is saying, they're projecting what they say made Mozart is actually what makes Lilliput. What makes Lilliput is the belief that something like a gift that somebody is lucky enough to magically have and doesn't have to do anything for. That's what makes a Lilliput person. That's why they stay. That's why they live and die in Lilliput, because they think they already know it all. They think they are superior to Mozart in terms of intelligence and education. It's just they weren't lucky enough. And because they think it works like that, they stay in Lilliput. So what you are being led to believe makes a Mozart is in reality what makes a person in Lilliput. And this here is what makes a Mozart. Mozart said he knows more about music than anybody else. And when you compare the knowledge you've heard in this course on Appoggiaturas and the next chapter, and that'll be the next course, will be a course on the trill, on trills, you can think, what does Lilliput say about the trill? And then you can find out what you're going to learn about the trill. And you can think as well that Mozart and Beethoven knows this. And that the insight and knowledge they have compared to Lilliput, compared to the experts, compared to those people on the roll of honour, standing in front of a large audience after giving a masterclass, taking their bows, and the audience is there applauding the cult of themselves. And they're taking their bows, and they're wondering, I wonder what Bach would think of this. I forget what my point was, but you can see there's a huge discrepancy. And as long as you believe what they say makes a Mozart, you're stuck in Lilliput. but you don't have to be. Here I am providing you the opportunity to escape Lilliput. Thanks to Bach. Okay, so next will be the chapter on trills. Thanks. Bye.